There is something different about talking to someone who grew up in the 90s. It is not obvious at first, not dramatic, not easily named, but it is there in the way they listen fully, without hurry, in the way they tolerate a pause, without rushing to fill it, in the way they seem present without needing to prove it, in how they hold a conversation like they are genuinely there without performing being there. For a long time, this has been mistaken for personality, for introversion, for temperament. But that explanation does not quite land, because psychology says something more precise. This is not who they are. This is when they grew up. And the difference between who you are and when you grew up is one of the most underappreciated forces shaping human behavior. What you are sensing is not detachment. It is not nostalgia. It is regulation. A nervous system that learned how to be with itself before it learned how to broadcast itself. And once you understand that sequence, the order in which those two things arrived, almost everything else about this generation becomes clear. People who grew up in the 90s occupy a psychological position no generation before or after them fully shares. Not purely analog, not truly digital. Their early years were shaped by a world that moved slowly enough to feel solid, where communication required intention, connection required effort, and if you missed something, it was simply gone. Then, almost without warning, the ground shifted. Technology did not arrive gradually, it accelerated. Speed became the expectation. Availability became the norm. Visibility became currency. This generation had to adapt while their sense of self was still forming. They were never meant to choose a side. They were shaped to carry both. Now consider what that early world actually produced, because the psychological consequences of it are still echoing in how this generation thinks, relates, and moves. Childhood in the 90s unfolded without a record button. Moments did not come with a pause function. There was no instant replay, no archive waiting online to be revisited. Saturday morning cartoons could not be rewound. Embarrassing moments faded instead of being preserved in permanent digital records. Joy existed fully in the present because there was no expectation it would be captured, shared, or validated afterward. Presence was not a practice. It was a requirement. When moments cannot be saved, the mind learns to stay. A nervous system that develops without constant external observation learns how to be internally anchored. It does not need to perform awareness in order to feel real. It does not require witnesses to trust that an experience mattered. Psychologist Jennifer Campbell's research on self-concept clarity found that identity formed privately, without audience, without documentation, tends to be more stable under pressure because it was built for the self, not for the self's representation. Later, when the tools of documentation arrived, they could use them, but their sense of presence did not depend on them. If any of this is landing, if you recognize yourself in this portrait, take a moment to like this video. It helps more people find this conversation. And if exploring the quieter psychological patterns behind human behavior is something you want to keep doing, subscribe. This is exactly what we do here. Then there was boredom, not a problem to be immediately solved, but something you eventually learned to sit with. There was no algorithm stepping in the moment. Stimulation dropped. When boredom arrived, it stayed. And that forced a choice. Remain uncomfortable, or create something from the empty space. Over time, this built something more fundamental than creativity. It trained emotional self-regulation, the capacity to let discomfort rise, peak, and fade without needing immediate relief. The foundation for being alone without panic, for waiting without agitation, for feeling restless without immediately numbing it. When the outside world goes still, the inside world does not disappear. It wakes up. And then there was waiting built into daily life, not as a lesson, but as a condition. Waiting for movies at the video store. Hoping the radio DJ would not talk over the intro of a favorite song. Saving allowance for weeks to buy a single compact disc. Desire did not lead directly to fulfillment. Time sat in between. Psychologically, delayed gratification is not just patience, it is trust. Trust that what you want can exist without being immediately satisfied. Trust that anticipation does not destroy desire, it deepens it. the brain learns that waiting is survivable and even meaningful. In relationships, this carries forward as emotional patience, the capacity to allow bonds to form gradually, to tolerate the middle phase where progress is slow and invisible. Not every connection needs to be forced into intensity immediately. Some things ripen. Then the transition came, and it came while identity was still forming. Privacy, before the 90s ended, was not a setting you managed. It was a default you lived inside. You called someone's house and spoke to whoever answered. Being unreachable was ordinary. Then, almost suddenly, those rules dissolved. Messages became instant. Silence started to feel suspicious. Sharing shifted from an option to a quiet obligation. This generation was old enough to encode the before, to hold the memory of it, and young enough to be reshaped by what replaced it. That dual timeline awareness is not nostalgia. It is structural, it shapes perception. They know how the world felt before constant visibility and how it feels after. They are not resisting change. They are holding the memory of another way of being one, where life did not need an audience to feel complete. This produces what might be called emotional bilingualism. From the outside, their comfort with silence can look like distance, a pause before responding, a tolerance for gaps in conversation, no urgency to fill every moment with words. But this is not an emotional absence. It is emotional fluency. They learned silence before they learned constant stimulation. They know that connection does not disappear when words pause. It simply changes form. For many people today, silence triggers anxiety. It reads as rejection or loss. For those shaped in the 90s, silence is often neutral. Sometimes it is grounding. Their nervous system learned to stay regulated without continuous input, which means they can be genuinely, fully present in a conversation without needing it to sustain them. But there is a cost to all of this that rarely gets named. Adaptability, when deep and long enough, trains you to minimize your own needs. When you grow up handling things on your own, you also learn to absorb discomfort quietly instead of signaling it outward. Resilience becomes visible. Strain remains hidden. Many people from this generation are read as emotionally self-sufficient, low maintenance, unbothered. And to some degree that perception is accurate, but it overlooks the continuous, invisible work of recalibrating to environments that do not pause. When something is heavy, they simply adjust. The word adjust hides everything it costs. Many people from this generation also carry a feeling that is difficult to explain. Not burnout, not pessimism, more like a sense of having lived through more than their age seems to justify. They often feel older than the calendar says they should, not because they grew up too fast, but because they watched a world disappear while they were still learning to belong in it. Speed replaced rhythm, exposure replaced privacy, constant adaptation replaced stability. Psychologists might call this emotional gravity. Not sadness, exactly, more like weight. The weight of knowing that something meaningful was lost, even if something useful was gained. It produces maturity without cynicism, awareness without bitterness. They appear grounded but tired, thoughtful but reserved. Not disillusioned with life, aware of how fragile systems can be, because they have watched one vanish. This awareness ages the nervous system faster than the calendar does. They do not chase every new trend, not out of resistance, but discernment. They know how quickly the news becomes normal, and they know how quietly the normal disappears. This is not a story about one generation being better than another. It is a story about timing, about what happens to a nervous system that forms in one kind of world and then learns to function in another, about the specific psychological signature that contrast leaves. They are not behind the world. They remember what the world has forgotten. What looks like distance is often balanced. What looks like slowness is often steadiness. What looks like detachment is a nervous system that learned presence before it was asked to perform it and never entirely forgot the difference. Do you recognize this in yourself, that particular feeling of carrying two timelines, or feeling older than the world around you accounts for? Leave it in the comments. More people understand this specific kind of weight than the world has ever given language to.